Welcome to another Museum FAQ video. I'm Paul Orselli, President and Chief Instigator of POW, Paul Orselli Workshop, here on Long Island. And lucky me, I'm joined today by Jeanne Vergeront. Hello, Jeanne, how are you?
Hi, Paul. I'm fine, thank you.
That's great. Well, normally the way we start these things out is I ask the guest or the guests to tell us a little bit about their background because as is often the case, especially in people connected to museums, the path is not a straight line. So I think it's always interesting. So if you could tell us about your background, and then after that, we'll launch into the main part of the conversation.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to join you in this conversation. And it's great to be able to connect from Minneapolis to Baldwin, Long Island. Let's see, looking back, I studied early childhood development and education at the University of Wisconsin. And after teaching for several years, I realized that what I really liked to do was around preparing the environment for play and exploration, both indoor and outdoor environments. And I found a way to put together a graduate degree in what I would call user-based design, focusing on children's environments. And my research was conducted on adventure playgrounds in London. And the question that I was interested in is when children can build their own environments and choose where to play and choose their materials, where do they decide to play? And what could we learn from that in terms of understanding children's preferences for heights or enclosures, or what's movable and what's fixed. After graduate school, I started working for the Madison School District in a teacher center, and these were popping up all over the country at that time, very material intensive. They put the teacher and the learner at the center. And my teacher center work took me on some traveling, and on one trip I was in the Boston area. And when I was in the Boston area, I went to Boston Children's Museum, and this was my first time ever to a children's museum. And I decided as I walked out the door that I think I was going to start a children's museum. And as an amazing coincidence, when I got back to Madison, 3 of my early childhood colleagues from across the city had just come back from the Twin Cities. They had just been at Minnesota Children's Museum. They had just decided that they were going to start a children's museum. And they called me up. And
it was fate, it was destiny.
Mm-hmm. And so the 4 of us started Madison Children's Museum, and actually that was just 40 years ago now. Madison Children's Museum is celebrating its 40th anniversary. So for a period of time, I was a board member and a volunteer, and we built exhibits in Judy Garcia's driveway and, took them to the farmer's market, all the usual startup kinds of things. I moved to the Twin Cities then to be the head of exhibits and education at Minnesota Children's Museum. And it was a time of really rapid growth and development. We started planning a new building that was going to be 3 times the size of the previous building we'd been in. And Paul, you were one of the peer reviewers of our programmatic master plan. And I remember somebody said, "What's a programmatic master plan?" And I just said, "I don't know, but we're going to create one." That museum opened in 1995, and I realized I loved the planning, but I also realized the museum did not need me to be planning all the time. And I figured that if I started working independently, I could do planning work with museums that were starting up, that were growing, which were expanding, which were merging, and that I hope to be helpful to them as they moved from good intentions to public good. So one of my very first projects, Paul, you may remember this, was the early childhood space at Long Island Children's Museum.
I do remember.
And over the years, my planning work has included strategic planning and learning planning and long-term programmatic planning, which I've loved the variety. I also really found a particular interest in what I think of as the convergence of a museum's strategic interests and its long-term learning interests. And I call these learning frameworks. And they're a way for museums to consolidate their most important ideas about learning, how they understand learning in their setting, how do they view learners, how do they support learning experiences. In the mid-90s, I started learning about the municipal schools in Reggio Emilia in northern Italy. And there's some really interesting and important ways that those schools, a 60-year educational experiment, kind of link with in their aspirations with children's museums, science centers, the interactive museums. They're both very keen on understanding their audience and, you know, learning about their audience or their families, children and families' interests. They put the learner at the center. They believe in the idea of that they are social settings in which people learn through objects and materials is also a shared idea. And at the same time, there's some differences that are, of course, the contexts are quite different, not just different countries, but also schools versus museums, but that create an interesting kind of tension to, that has been useful to me in thinking about this. Inspired by an interview you did with me, Paul, for your blog in 2010, I started the Museum Notes blog. Just about
I set you on I put you on the dark side, but it's an excellent blog. As they say in YouTube land, we will include links and references in the description below. So.
Well, what I have liked writing about are sort of topics that seem kind of underexplored, or sometimes they're ones that several of my clients are all dealing with at the same time, challenging areas, or, you know, a lot of times, you know, it's just a question of like, what does this mean? Because we use a lot of phrases and words that we assume we know what they mean. And I guess that except for mentioning all the wonderful people I've met along the way, this sort of takes me to today. And one of the things as I've sort of, folded this journey is I realized how it was punctuated by times with you where we either worked together or you had something to offer that really have moved me along. And I really appreciate it. It was also just sort of like excellent timing. So thank you. I want to make sure I get to thank you for that.
Well, that's very kind of you. And obviously, you know how much I like and respect you and your work. And it's always interesting to hear, like I say, the paths that people take. So, yeah. And also you are such a well-spoken and calming personality. I could listen to you all day, but we only have a short period of time today. So we're going to focus on one thing. And speaking of your blog, and also you touched, as you were talking about your background, mentioned the word planning. There was a blog post that struck me as especially timely now in the times we are in. Even though it wasn't a brand new blog post. And it sort of talked about trying to find the balance, is the way I'll characterize it, between planning and chance, which just resonated with me for lots of reasons. And the blog post was very well written, and so many of the points just struck me that I said, oh, Jeanne, you should come. Let's have a conversation about this. And you're like, wait a second. Well, oh, how are we going to frame this? You know, it's like this is the Paul and Jeanne show here, planning and chance. And wait a second. So rather than get into that, I thought I would throw that out to start the conversation, because I know since you and I have spoken before this conversation, you have framed in a very thoughtful way some parameters related to this discussion around planning versus chance. So rather than have me talk about that, I'd much rather have people hear you talk about it. So maybe with planning, balancing planning and chance as a starting point, maybe we can start there.
Okay. You know, it's really hard for planning. As long as I've been planning, it's really hard not to notice that you can plan and plan and plan, but then at some point you let go, and either you stop the planning and it's action. And even if it's very thoroughly planned in all these different, you know, objectives and critical issues, at some point chance is going to intervene. And so there's some things that we can plan for and some things that we can't plan for. And whether this is true for whether they're broad organizational goals or resources and using them wisely, or an exhibition or an experience, or, you know, supporting self-directed learners. So sometimes that chance is that really wonderful surprise that arrives just in time, and sometimes it's kind of a dark presence that ends up at the door. And I, especially right now where we're in a time of a lot of unpredictability, uncertainty, this seems especially critical to think about, because we don't have a lot of things that we normally fall back on to do. You know, we can't say, what did we do the last time there was a global pandemic? Very few museums can do that. I
don't know. Let's go back 100 years and figure it out.
Right. And how many museums were around 100 years ago? It's really hard to benchmark with other museums or say, what did you learn from, you know, your experience? So, so we need both of these aspects, you know, this, on the one hand, this, you know, a planning mindset, and then an openness to chance and what might happen. And and if a museum has a plan or a strategic plan, that's helpful, but it's not really going to do enough because so many of the conditions have changed. So I started thinking about, well, how do we describe this territory between planning and chance? You can't plan too much, but it would be irresponsible not to be thinking about it. So, and there's just no step-by-step process. There's not a formula. We're not used to that. So I thought of 3 questions that I think have been helpful in thinking a little bit more about this. And with appreciation to Andrea Jones, here are the questions. Andrea, thank you very much. Question number 1 is, you know, what do we understand? And what do we understand about the situation the museum currently finds itself in and the community that it is serving? The second question is around, and these are really sets of questions, but I would describe this as sort of the overarching question, you know, what matters? What matters to the museum in terms of its long-term interests, its vision, its mission, what matters that needs to be protected or preserved? And then the last one is what's possible. And what's possible is about what are the kinds of opportunities that the museum would like to be poised to take advantage of. And this is where, of course, it gets kind of squishy because we really don't know what those are. These are like 3 questions in a row, but it's really not quite a linear process, in the sense that
Never,
it actually,
never.
it actually might be more like a spiral, in the sense that a museum at first explores what do we understand, then it explores what matters. Carrying both of those forward, it thinks about what is possible, and then goes back and revisits, what do we understand? Because each of these questions is going to surface something that is, has been under the radar a little bit. And it's like tightening the lug nuts on the wheel. So revisiting each one of those and sharpening the sense, I think also accomplishes a couple of things that are really important for this planning process. And those are around, asking questions, big, roomy questions, rather than how many people should be coming through the door on Tuesday afternoons. Also, it needs a lot of honesty and the capacity for people to ask hard questions and give hard answers that sometimes might be difficult. A tolerance for brokering priorities, because everything can't be number one. Also, other willingness to go out and ask what you don't understand. Just that made me think of something, that this first question about, we're often saying, what do we know? And I think by asking, what do we understand, where there's a recognition that what we know is relevant sort of to this moment in time. And I think that's another sort of guide here, is something that I would call the tentative case. I mean, I'm not sure that, a Latin teacher would like to hear that, but, language that needs to be, we could, or might we, or let's, and, together, but the language of certainty that we will do this, we will be here, is not very helpful in trying to allow for the opening of some possibilities.
Well, it's interesting, I'm just thinking about my background behind me, and this idea of certainty and needing not to be uncertain. I'm just thinking, if you're trying to build a house and you have a piece of wood that's 8 feet long, and it needs to go up in the ceiling, but the space available is only 7 feet. I mean, what are you going to do? Are you going to keep trying to jam that 8-foot piece into that 7-foot hole? And it seems like sometimes it feels like that's what museums are trying to do. Instead of saying, well, wait a second, what do we really need here? A 7-foot piece, can we cut this off so that we can use it? Or do we keep, it's like, no, we need a bigger hammer, just hit it harder, so.
Another way to characterize this between planning and chance is at Minnesota Children's Museum, in the shop, there was a sign that said, pound to fit and paint to match. So that's sort of like the planning idea. And then the sort of chance thing is sort of that magical thinking idea, that sort of like, well, we'll just, our cherished beliefs will, take over and come into play. And so there is that kind of an agility to move back and forth. And on a team for something like this, you want people who are both really comfortable with, loose, wide open thinking, and people, and this is also just a fact about how some people are this way and other people want that certainty. And that's part of the dialogue that makes this very challenging. On a group that you're putting together, even, I think you want that mix, that variety of viewpoints in lots of different ways. But you also want to make sure that everybody has a pretty good tolerance for lively conversation, because this is a lot of thinking together.
Well, there's two really interesting things in what you just said. It's interesting in these conversations how often the notion, I mean, it's sort of like planning and chance, the notion that there are people in an organization that it's really important to them, that they feel they understand there's a firm foundation, they understand everything about what's going on. And then there are other people in the organization, and both are equally important and valuable. There are other people who are like, okay, now we're heading off into the unknown. And, you know, the people who are like, hey, now we're heading off into the unknown. Oh, why are we getting held back by these people? They're so slow. Or the flip side, those crazy people, they're going to blow our budget, or they're going to get kids hurt. This is a crazy idea. I mean, how to balance those is interesting. But the other thing that I'd be interested, maybe if you could touch on, is this notion I'll just characterize as robust conversations. Not always conversations that immediately end in happy agreement, but conversations there's a little bit of give and take and tussle to them. Right. But often those robust conversations seem to bring us to maybe a better place, a different place than we started.
Yeah. Well, these are not going to be easy conversations because there's nothing simple, about this. And, one of the pieces of this, when thinking about what matters, it relies on framing and reframing what matters to the museum on the other side of this. So trying to frame that, is our goal or is our hope to survive? Is it to thrive? Is it to reopen? Is it to be a smaller museum? Some of those kinds of questions that might be hard, that are hard, will, by spending the time on them early on, will create that frame for some other considerations. So, this is not the kind of process you want to start over 4 times and say, oh no, let's think about it this way. You want to have some of those really chewy conversations early on, so that you have this frame of reference. And I think it is embedded in the vision and the mission and the values and the promise and possibilities of the community, that if that's the reference point, then some of these other pieces, and this is not the time to necessarily say, oh, let's throw out our mission or our vision. It feels like that's too much of a luxury for most museums to have. You may emphasize something in your mission or your vision more at this period of time, but it's not like you're going to suddenly become a science museum is going to become a dance studio or something. So grounding, some of these tips are like big questions, frame and reframe what you're talking about, broker priorities, agreeing on those at the beginning, grounding the thinking together process in the vision and the mission and the values, framing what is really critical to have happen as a result of this. Those are, it's not going to eliminate any kind of conflict at all. Conflict is, present, but that sense of trust, that sense of generosity, I think that's another, assuming that other people that you may not agree with, but that they are, that they have good intentions, and even though it may feel for a moment that nobody is, listening to you or something, you have to sort of sit with it for a while. And it's, as I talk about it, I realize it's so inadequate to talk about these moments, but you feel them in such intensity when the time comes. But I think that people believe in people's good intentions and the long-term interest of the museum.
And I think that sort of approach towards people and difficult topics extends, you might say, extends beyond museums to our current social and political moments, especially here in the United States, because if you, at your heart of heart, even if there's somebody you disagree with, if you can truly think, well, this person also wants, good things for their children or positive things for their community, or they really they want things to move forward and prosper for everyone. The approaches we take might differ, but if you sincerely believe people's intentions, like you said, are good, then you can have a robust but a respectful conversation with people,
right.
And you might end up in a place where, okay, you know what? I came in thinking about this like an exhibit, and then I realized, you know what? This is the time for me to be quiet, because now when I hear everybody else talk, we're clearly going in a different direction. We are going in a clearly different direction, and not a direction that I came into this meeting or this process or this part of the exhibit thinking we would. And so I think, it's not easy, but I think the best projects are ones that that does happen, that people really have their eye on the prize. Why are we doing this? Why are we moving from Bandana Square to the new Children's Museum, the Minnesota Children's Museum downtown? Right. Why is that important? What do we all think about that? And yeah, that's great.
Yeah, and there were lots of, it's like, well, why don't we just, I don't know, stay the way we are? Or why don't we, go back to Minneapolis rather than to St. Paul? Years ago it was a master plan for Creative Discovery Museum in Chattanooga, and somebody in Chattanooga wrote an article for the city magazine about the process, and he called it, it's like in our field, we can say it was an exhibit master planning process. He called it a discovery process. And then he clarified it and said, it's a disciplined discovery process. And I feel like that has proven to be a really useful image to hold, because there is discovery. You don't know exactly, where you're going to find the bumps along the way. You don't know exactly your destination, but the discipline, like a set of questions that you hope to answer. And this is where these kind of big, roomy questions, they're not these really they're not quantifiable kinds of questions, are going to be useful in being open to discovery, but also making progress that is, could fundamentally affect the outcome or the future of your museum. I once read the definition of civility was listening to somebody you disagree with as though they could be right. And I think that's it's a good exercise for all of us. So I think also this idea of that it's harder to get to this idea of the planning of the chance, because we don't know what chance looks like. And there's some questions there that are important to think about, like what's our tolerance for, for risk, or our metabolism for change? What's our capacity? Where do we have some capacity that we could sort of leverage to be ready for something? And what might some of these opportunities look like? I mean, we can't really characterize chance, but we could talk about these possibilities. And I think you and I came up with a few when we talked recently, which is you know, a museum in the UK was, through their museum shop, was putting out sort of the staples of food for people who needed it, who came to the museum. There is a museum, some museums are starting to think about how they could be part of the ramping up for school. You know, if schools don't have enough space for social distancing, museums do have those kinds of spaces. Many museums have those kinds of spaces. This idea of learning pods, of sort of self-forming mini school groups that are, is another way of thinking that a museum, you know, they might have a different role on the local learning landscape by doing something like that. You know, some museums are, I know of one museum that's in the very early startup stages. Its location is going to be right between two sections of regional trail. And, you know, they are realizing that they could become part of a link between those two trails that helps. It may sound like a small thing. It helps connect the community. It can get people outside. It does touch on an interest that they have in being part of the regional infrastructure around well-being, in terms of, you know, getting out, meeting and connecting. Somebody realized, another museum realized that they had a huge parking lot. You know, some of the assets that museums have, you know, if you look at them through the other end of the binoculars, they can look very different, or you can link your assets differently, and you might end up with a, you know, may not get you right there for that, you know, final possibility, but it may be a useful step in that discipline discovery process. And that's where some of those off-the-wall thinkers, that people who are sometimes called off-the-wall thinkers, can be really useful, because they'll just see something in a completely different way.
Well, and I think this might be a time when we do need some off the wall ideas, you know, there, and I don't mean like, you know, to tell people to do things that might endanger them, but just like you said, the example of the parking lot. Wow, what can we do with this parking lot? How could we be helpful to people with this parking lot that's just lying fallow, literally? So, well, oh, please go ahead.
Oh, just means keeping the antenna up, you know, in terms of what else is going on, is going to be especially important here. You know, it might be that a really valued service for youth closes down. Well, the museum could bring that into their set of offerings. Maybe they've had some sort of week offerings for that age group of, I don't know, 13 to 17-year-olds. The unfortunate reality that some museums are going to close their doors also means that there's a possibility of mergers, that, you know, a museum may merge, and if you have an overlapping mission, you can, you know, that should invite some good thinking about what might be possible.
Well, and that may be a nice positive place to end it, to leave people thinking about the possibilities as one of these points that you raised as a way to navigate planning and chance. So, yes. Well, as I mentioned earlier, we of course will provide some links to your original blog post that prompted this conversation, and some other links and references that you might like to include that touch on some of the things that we discussed today. But I just wanted to say thank you again for taking the time. It's always a pleasure to see you and speak with you. And fortunately, the network behaved. That's always a positive aspect
Always
of these,
nice. Right.
of these things. So thanks very much, Jeanne. I appreciate it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Paul. I guess
Yeah.
I do have one thing to add, which is
Yeah, sure.
for people to be kind to one another. This is a time where we probably need that generosity, of spirit. And I think you have all but said this in your comments today. And I just would reinforce that, which is, this is really a time to be good to one another.
For sure. Okay, and with that, I'll wish you well. I know you have plum ketchup in the offing, so that's. But thanks again.
Thank you, Paul.
Take care.